The mess hall at Fort Richardson fell silent as Staff Sergeant Martinez slammed his tray down, gravy splattering across the metal surface like abstract art painted in frustration. "This slop again?" he sneered, loud enough for everyone in the dining area to hear his complaint echoing off the sterile walls. Behind the serving counter, Elena Santos didn't even look up from ladling mashed potatoes with mechanical precision. She'd heard worse complaints in her 3 months working the kitchen facilities. What Martinez didn't know, what none of the 200 soldiers stationed at this remote Alaskan outpost knew, was that the "just a cook" he was mocking had once led men twice his rank through the most classified operations the United States military had ever conducted in the shadows of modern warfare. The small, weathered patch sewn discreetly into her apron's inner lining told a completely different story than the one everyone believed they knew about her. A story that was about to explode into the open in ways no one could predict or prepare for adequately, because tonight Fort Richardson would face a crisis that would strip away every assumption they'd made about the quiet woman who served their meals with silent efficiency. The woman who never spoke unless spoken to, who kept her head down and her opinions to herself, who seemed to fade into the background like institutional furniture. Tonight, they would discover that some people are exactly who they appear to be, while others are wearing masks so convincing that even trained military personnel can't see through the carefully constructed facade. Elena Santos had spent her entire adult life perfecting the art of being underestimated, and tonight that skill would either save Fort Richardson or doom everyone on the base to a fate worse than death. The wind outside howled like a warning that nobody was listening to carefully enough. The Alaskan wilderness stretched endlessly beyond the base perimeter, a frozen wasteland that served as both protection and prison for the soldiers stationed at Fort Richardson. At 42 years old, Elena moved through her daily routines with an efficiency that most people attributed to years of repetitive kitchen work, and nothing more significant than that. They were completely wrong about everything they thought they understood. Every precise movement, every calculated step, every way she positioned herself near exits and maintained situational awareness, these were habits carved deep into her muscle memory by operations that officially never happened and never would be acknowledged. She'd been Elena Santos, the unremarkable cook, for exactly 97 days now. Before that transformation, she'd been Colonel Elena Santos, commanding officer of Task Force Wraith, a unit so highly classified that even its existence was compartmentalized within the Pentagon's blackest and most sensitive programs that operated beyond congressional oversight. The transition from colonel to cook hadn't been her choice or her idea in any way whatsoever. 3 months ago, during what should have been a routine extraction mission in Eastern Europe, she'd been burned by a double agent working within their operational network. Her face had been compromised, her real identity leaked to multiple hostile intelligence services across 3 different continents. The military bureaucracy had faced 2 stark options when dealing with this unprecedented security breach: eliminate the problem permanently through methods that would never appear in any official documentation, or bury her so deep within the system that she'd never surface again as a recognizable threat. They chose burial over termination, though Elena often wondered if death might have been the more merciful option given her current circumstances. Within 48 hours of emergency extraction from a safe house in Prague, Elena Santos, the decorated colonel, was declared killed in a routine training accident that never actually occurred. Elena Santos, the forgettable cook, was born simultaneously with a backstory so mundane, so carefully unremarkable that no intelligence service would ever waste resources investigating her fictional background. She'd volunteered for the remotest posting available in the continental United States, Fort Richardson, Alaska, where the brutal isolation would keep her safely hidden and the mindless work would theoretically keep her trained mind occupied with something other than the ghosts of her previous life. The mandatory psychological evaluation had been particularly brutal in its clinical assessment. The subject shows excellent adaptation to civilian role, the final report had concluded with bureaucratic satisfaction. Recommend permanent reassignment to non-combat duties with minimal security clearance requirements. What they hadn't documented in their official assessment was how her eyes still automatically swept every room for tactical advantages and potential threats, how she'd memorized the entire base's defensive positions within her first week of kitchen duty, or how she kept the industrial kitchen knives arranged for maximum efficiency in close quarters combat rather than food preparation. But tonight, absolutely none of that careful preparation and psychological conditioning would matter in the slightest. Tonight, the past would collide violently with the present in ways that would completely shatter her carefully constructed new life and identity. The first explosion came at precisely 2147 hours, rattling windows throughout the base with enough force to send Elena bolt upright in her narrow military cot. Her body reacted with trained reflexes before her conscious mind could even process what was happening, rolling immediately to the floor, automatically assessing angles of potential attack, calculating distances to weapons that she no longer officially carried. But she was supposed to be just a cook now, nothing more than a civilian contractor with no combat training or tactical awareness. Cooks didn't instinctively analyze blast patterns or automatically reach for sidearms. They were no longer authorized to carry under any circumstances. She forced herself to move like a confused civilian would, stumbling toward the window with what appeared to be appropriate confusion and fear rather than tactical assessment. Outside her window, orange flames licked hungrily at the communication tower, sending sparks cascading into the Arctic night like deadly fireworks. The second explosion followed exactly 30 seconds later with mathematical precision, taking out the motor pool in a fireball that illuminated the entire compound. Elena's blood went cold as ice water as recognition dawned with horrible clarity. She recognized this attack pattern from her previous life, from operations she'd both conducted and defended against in theaters around the world. This wasn't random terrorism or a training accident that had somehow gone catastrophically wrong. This was a professional military assault, executed with the kind of precision that only came from extensive planning and elite training. Someone was systematically dismantling Fort Richardson's ability to communicate with the outside world and mount an effective response to invasion. And they were doing it exactly the way she would have planned and executed such an operation herself. The question that made her stomach clench with dread wasn't who was attacking their isolated base in the middle of nowhere. The terrifying question that she didn't want to consider was whether this entire assault was specifically designed to flush her out of hiding. The base alarm finally wailed to life with its distinctive warbling tone as Elena pulled on her clothes with practiced efficiency. Through the thin walls of the temporary housing, she could hear other personnel shouting in confusion, panicked voices demanding answers that absolutely no one could provide with any degree of certainty. Standard protocol dictated that she needed to reach the designated evacuation point with the other non-essential personnel, but every instinct she possessed was screaming at her to reach the command center and understand exactly what kind of threat they were facing. But Elena Santos, the cook, had absolutely no business anywhere near operational planning or tactical coordination. She was supposed to evacuate with the other civilian contractors, huddle in the designated safe areas like frightened sheep, and wait for the real soldiers to handle whatever crisis had erupted. Instead, she found herself moving through the base's maintenance corridors with the kind of efficiency that comes from extensive reconnaissance and preparation. She was using routes she'd memorized during her first week of kitchen duty, but had pretended not to know existed for the past 3 months. Old habits died hard, especially when those habits had kept her alive through dozens of operations in hostile territory around the globe. And right now, those old habits might be the only thing standing between Fort Richardson and complete destruction. The small patch sewn into her apron seemed to burn against her ribs like a brand as she moved through shadows toward the command bunker. Task Force Wraith might be officially dead and buried in classified files, but its commanding officer was very much alive, and she was about to prove that some ghosts refuse to stay buried when the living are threatened by forces they don't understand and can't fight effectively. She reached the heavily fortified command bunker just as the third explosion rocked the entire base, this one targeting the armory with devastating precision. Major Collins, the base's executive officer and ranking combat commander, was shouting orders into a completely dead radio, while junior officers ran around the command center like panicked chickens with their heads cut off. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly, and nobody seemed to have any idea how to respond effectively to this coordinated assault. "Sir," Elena said quietly, stepping into the chaos with calm authority that immediately drew attention. "The communication lines have been severed in a specific sequence. This is a coordinated military assault designed to systematically isolate the base before the main attack commences." Collins spun around, with his face flushed red with stress and mounting panic. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, with the kind of authority that comes from years of command experience. "Santos, sir. Kitchen staff," she replied, with the same quiet confidence that had characterized her previous response. The dismissal in his eyes was immediate and absolute, exactly what she'd expected from a career officer facing an unprecedented crisis. "Get to the evacuation point with the other civilians immediately," he snapped, with barely contained frustration. "This is military business, not something for kitchen staff to worry about." But Elena didn't move toward the exit or show any intention of following his direct order. Instead, she studied the tactical display with the kind of professional assessment that comes from years of combat experience, her trained eye immediately picking up patterns that the panicked officers were completely missing in their confusion. "Sir, they've systematically hit communications, transportation, and weapons storage in textbook sequence. Next target will be the perimeter sensors, followed by a direct assault on the main gate. You have maybe 10 minutes before they breach the outer defensive perimeter." Collins stared at her like she'd suddenly grown a second head, or started speaking in ancient languages that nobody could possibly understand. How the hell would a cook know anything about... His incredulous words were cut off abruptly by the fourth explosion, occurring exactly where Elena had predicted with mathematical precision. The perimeter sensors went completely dark on the tactical display, leaving them blind to enemy movement in the outer defensive zone. "Jesus Christ," Collins whispered in a voice filled with growing horror and dawning realization. "How did you know that was going to happen?" Elena felt the enormous weight of her decision settling heavily on her shoulders like a lead blanket. Once she crossed this particular line, there would be absolutely no going back to the safety and anonymity she'd fought so hard to achieve. But Fort Richardson was about to fall to enemy forces, and 200 American soldiers were about to die in the middle of nowhere if someone didn't take immediate command of the deteriorating situation. Someone with the extensive training and combat experience necessary to mount an effective defense against professional military assault. Someone exactly like the woman they all thought was just a cook who served their meals and stayed invisible. "Because I've planned and executed this exact type of operation before, sir," she said quietly, watching Collins's face change dramatically as the full implications of her statement began to hit him like a physical blow. And if we don't move right now and implement effective countermeasures, everyone on this base is going to die tonight." The small patch hidden in her apron suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, heavy with the weight of secrets and classified operations that she'd tried so hard to leave behind forever. Task Force Wraith was about to rise from the dead whether she wanted it to or not. The transformation was immediate and absolutely terrifying to witness firsthand. Elena Santos, the invisible cook, vanished completely, replaced instantaneously by a woman who radiated command presence like a physical force that filled the entire room. "I need a secure line to SOCOM immediately," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos like a perfectly sharpened blade. "Tell them Wraith 6 is alive and requesting immediate tactical support for defensive operations." Collins's face went white as fresh snow as the implications of that particular call sign hit him with devastating force. Everyone in the Special Operations community knew that call sign, even if they'd never heard it spoken aloud in official or unofficial settings. Wraith 6 was a ghost story, a legend whispered about in the darkest corners of military intelligence and special operations communities around the world. The officer who'd led Task Force Wraith through operations so highly classified that they didn't officially exist in any documentation that could ever be subpoenaed or investigated. The woman who'd been declared killed in a training accident exactly 3 months ago, according to all official records. Except she was standing right in front of them, very much alive and breathing. And somehow she'd been working in their kitchen for months without anyone recognizing who she really was. "That's completely impossible," Collins breathed, with the kind of shock that comes from having your entire worldview shattered in an instant. "Wraith 6 is dead. I saw the casualty reports myself." Elena smiled for the first time in 3 months, and it wasn't the carefully practiced expression of a cook trying to blend invisibly into the background. It was the predatory grin of an apex predator who'd just identified her prey and was preparing to hunt. "Reports of my death," she said with quiet satisfaction, "have been greatly exaggerated for operational security purposes." The secure line crackled to life as Elena's fingers flew over the communication console with the kind of practiced precision that comes from years of emergency operations under fire. "SOCOM. This is Wraith 6 requesting immediate authentication and tactical support. Authentication code Delta 77 Alpha 9. The voice on the other end of the secure connection went completely silent for a full 10 seconds before responding with obvious shock and confusion. "Wraith 6, according to our records, you are supposed to be KIA as of 3 months ago. Explain your current operational status immediately." Elena's jaw tightened with frustration as she watched the tactical display showing enemy forces advancing steadily toward their position. The attackers had successfully breached the outer perimeter defenses and were moving toward the main compound in perfect textbook formation that spoke of extensive training and professional military discipline. "Explanations can wait for debriefing, Control. Fort Richardson is currently under coordinated assault by what appears to be Spetsnaz-trained operatives using advanced tactics. I need immediate air support and a full tactical response team for defensive operations." Another pause that lasted far too long given their deteriorating tactical situation. "Negative, Wraith 6. Your security clearance was permanently revoked upon official termination of service. You are not authorized to request tactical support or coordinate military operations under any circumstances." Elena cut the transmission with a sharp gesture and turned to face the stunned officers gathered around the command console. The look in her eyes made seasoned combat veterans instinctively take a step backward. "Gentlemen," she said with deadly quiet, "it appears we're completely on our own tonight." Major Collins found his voice first, though it came out strained and uncertain. "I don't understand what's happening here or who you really are, but I'm still the ranking officer on this base and responsible for all personnel." Elena nodded with genuine respect for his position and authority. "Yes, sir, you absolutely are the ranking officer. And as ranking officer, you have exactly 2 choices available to you right now. You can continue trying to coordinate a defensive response using tactics you learned at West Point against an enemy that's already inside your perimeter and systematically destroying your capability to resist. Or you can temporarily transfer operational command to someone who's actually fought this exact type of engagement before and knows how to win." She gestured toward the tactical display where red dots representing enemy forces were steadily advancing through their outer defenses like a slow-motion avalanche of destruction. Either way, sir, you need to make that decision in the next 60 seconds, because that's exactly how long we have before they reach this command bunker. Collins stared at the tactical display with growing horror, then at Elena with dawning understanding, then back at the display, showing their rapidly deteriorating defensive position. When he looked up again, his face was grim, but filled with the kind of resolve that separates real leaders from mere administrators. What do you need from us? Elena smiled again, and this time it was pure Predator recognizing that the hunt was about to begin in earnest. Everything you've got, sir, and then some creative improvisation that's not covered in any manual. The next 20 minutes transformed Fort Richardson from a chaotic disaster zone into a precision military operation that would have made Sun Tzu himself proud of the tactical brilliance being displayed. Elena's commands were crisp, clear, and absolutely authoritative in ways that brooked no argument or hesitation from anyone. She repositioned defensive teams with surgical precision, systematically turned the base's own infrastructure into an elaborate maze of carefully prepared kill zones, and somehow managed to re-establish communication with units that had been completely cut off since the first coordinated attack. Watching her work was like observing a master pianist performing a complex symphony, every movement deliberate and purposeful, every decision building toward a larger masterpiece of tactical brilliance that was beautiful in its deadly efficiency. "How is she doing this?" whispered Lieutenant Parker in amazement, as Elena coordinated a flanking maneuver that would have impressed Alexander the Great himself. Collins shook his head in wonder and growing respect. "I don't know exactly how, but whoever she really is beneath that cook's apron, she's saving all our lives tonight." Outside in the frozen Alaskan wilderness, the sound of sustained gunfire echoed through the night like deadly thunder as Elena's hastily reorganized defenses began to bite back viciously against their attackers. For the first time since the coordinated assault had begun with such devastating effectiveness, Fort Richardson was fighting back with professional competence. And incredibly, against all odds and expectations, they were actually winning the engagement through superior tactics and leadership. The tide of battle turned decisively at 23:47 hours when Elena's tactical genius became fully apparent to everyone watching the engagement unfold. She'd been systematically herding the attacking forces into a carefully prepared kill zone, using the base's own apparent defensive weaknesses as irresistible bait for an enemy that thought they understood the tactical situation. "All units, execute pattern Delta on my mark," she commanded, with voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them on all sides. Mark. The night exploded with perfectly coordinated defensive fire as every position opened up simultaneously in a symphony of destruction. The attacking force, caught in a crossfire they couldn't have anticipated or prepared for, began to crumble under the devastating response. But Elena wasn't finished with them yet. "Hunter teams, you are cleared for pursuit operations. Drive them back to their extraction point and deny them any possibility of successful withdrawal." Collins watched in absolute awe as the woman who'd served him mashed potatoes just hours earlier orchestrated one of the most brilliant tactical victories he'd ever witnessed in 2 decades of military service. "Who are you really?" he asked quietly during a brief lull in the coordinated defensive operations. Elena paused in her tactical coordination efforts and looked at him with eyes that had seen far too much classified horror and carried too many state secrets. "Someone who was supposed to stay permanently dead, sir. Someone who's about to have a very difficult conversation with some very powerful people in Washington who thought they'd solved a problem permanently." The cleanup and securing operations took another 2 hours of careful work. When it was finally over, 14 enemy combatants were confirmed dead, 3 were captured for interrogation, and not a single American soldier had been lost in the engagement. It was, by any military standard of measurement, an absolutely perfect victory that would be studied in war colleges for decades. But Elena knew it was also the definitive end of her carefully constructed new life and hard-won anonymity. As dawn broke over the brutal Alaskan wilderness, She stood in the command bunker, slowly removing the small patch from her apron. The fabric was worn and faded from years of careful concealment, but the symbol was still clearly visible to anyone who knew how to read it properly. Task Force Wraith, Collins read aloud with growing understanding of what he was seeing. And I thought that particular unit was officially disbanded years ago after some kind of scandal. Elena folded the patch carefully and slipped it into her pocket like a talisman. Officially, it was completely disbanded, and all records were sealed permanently. Unofficially, we've been running operations that the government desperately needs done, but can never acknowledge or take responsibility for publicly. Operations that require people who don't officially exist on any roster or organizational chart. She looked around the command center one final time with the expression of someone saying goodbye to a place they'd grown unexpectedly fond of. People exactly like me, who are supposed to be dead and buried. The helicopter arrived at exactly 0600 hours, unmarked and carrying passengers that Elena recognized from her previous classified life. As she gathered her few personal belongings, Major Collins approached her one final time. "I have to ask," he said with obvious curiosity, "if you're really who I think you are, why were you working in our kitchen for 3 months?" Elena shouldered her pack and looked out at the base she'd successfully defended, the soldiers she'd saved from certain death, and the simple life she was about to leave behind again. "But because sometimes, Major, the best place to hide a dangerous ghost is in plain sight where nobody thinks to look. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone assumes is just a cook who serves meals and stays invisible." She walked toward the waiting helicopter with its rotors already spinning, then paused and turned back one final time. "Take care of yourself, sir. And the next time someone tells you a person is just anything, remember tonight and what you learned about assumptions." The helicopter lifted off as the morning sun painted the mountains gold. Fort Richardson returned to normal operations, but nothing would ever be quite the same. In the kitchen, Elena's replacement would find everything perfectly organized, efficiently arranged, and ready for immediate service, just the way a consummate professional would leave it.